Hello, how are you doing today? It's a lovely Saturday. I am in Brooklyn, New York City, 5:30 p.m. It's beautiful outside, lovely weather, very nice, and I am glad that you all are joining me today. We're going to have a great discussion about a lot of interesting, serious topics about what's going on in the world today. I know it's a very peaceful day. I just had my Saturday hamburger and really enjoyed it. And I hope that you all are up for a lovely, friendly chat. Shout out to Komsomal, hello there. Shout out to Orga Mecca, hi, my friend Caleb. Shout out to Night by Night, glad you're joining me. Shout out to BJ Murphy. Now, folks, I am pouring the beverage that will not be named, the forbidden unnamed beverage, as I get ready to talk about many things. I'm ready to answer your questions. Shout out to Shonen Ronan. Hello, hello, hello. Shout out to Jacob Maxey. Hello, hello, hello. So much we can talk about today, so be sure to tweet this out, make this a bigger conversation, bring more people in to what's going to be a lovely, lovely discussion, right? It's a lovely weather. Shout out to Sunzi. Shout out to Dante Solano. Shout out to Gabriel Castro. All of you joining us here. What a peaceful, lovely day it is here. So much to discuss, so much happening in the world. So, and please, if there's anything you want me to talk about, please put it in the comments, because the more I have to talk about, the more fun we have, the more interactive this becomes. There you go. Now, shout out to Steve-O Awesome. Shout out to Bird Worldist. So much we can talk about, so I'm going to take my first sip of the unnamed beverage, of the unnamed diet soda. I hope you all are taking the time to tweet this out. Someone's asking me to talk about Libya. Someone's asking me to talk about Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Well, folks, I'm going to start out, before I get to the international scene, I'm going to start out talking about domestic issues in the United States. And I'm going to begin by making a prediction. I am predicting at this point that the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court ruling, which makes abortion, the termination of a pregnancy by a woman, legal in every part of the United States, I believe that will, at some point, not immediately, perhaps not as quickly as some people are anticipating, I believe it will be overturned. I believe that Roe versus Wade will be overturned, and that certain states will be granted permission by the U.S. Supreme Court to deny women the right to an abortion. And the reason that I believe Roe versus Wade is going to be overturned is actually pretty simple. Basically, Donald Trump took office because in the Rust Belt states and in the southern states, there's a lot of people who used to be part of the prosperous middle class of the United States of America, that white picket fence, happy middle class, working class, well-paid labor aristocracy existence. They used to be very comfortable, right? You go to the suburbs around Cleveland, right? Lakewood, you go to the suburbs of Chicago, Evanston, right? You go throughout the South. You go throughout rural areas, right? I mean, I grew up in a rural area in Ohio, for example. You go all throughout this country. And for those of us who live in urban centers, it's very easy to forget. But if you go outside of urban centers, this is a very, very big country. And there are a lot of small towns. There are a lot of suburbs. And the folks in those small towns and suburbs used to have a very, very, very comfortable life, for the most part. There was a lot of middle-class jobs. There was a lot of factory jobs. There were a lot of, just kind of middle-class jobs. And all of that is starting to dry up. And the financial crisis of 2008 was very much a response to the fact that the spending power of average Americans has been consistently decreasing since the 1980s. Since the 1980s, the ability of average Americans to buy stuff has been going down gradually. They talk about the jobless recoveries. And over the course of time, the average income of American families has been decreasing. And as that process has continued, we've been seeing life for people in those suburbs, life for people in those rural areas getting gradually worse. And as that process has taken place, a lot of those folks have turned to religion for solace, and that the religious right, really, I mean, it's always been a factor. You've always had fanatically religious people in the United States, but what people call the religious right, the entity that they refer to as the religious right, Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, the evangelical movement aligned with the Republican Party, that faction gained a lot of power. As people were losing their jobs and incomes, they turned to religion. You had the rise of the mega churches. You had the rise of non-denominational Christianity, right? It used to be, sure, you had a lot of fundamentalists and conservative Christians, but you had the rise of these mega churches where you ask them, are you a Baptist? Are you a Lutheran? They'd be like, we just believe the Bible, man. We just believe the Bible. It's the Word of God. You know, we don't care about all that other stuff. And they'd have the rock band and the big movie screen at the front showing what the preacher is talking about, and everyone gets into their kind of emotional thing, and they get all their emotions out on Sunday morning. And that movement that was really key to, the rise of the Republican Party and really the neocon faction within the Republican Party. That faction, they gained a lot of power in the 1980s. They were, they were very key in fighting against Bill Clinton and the contract for America and all of that was going on. That the Bush administration really, gave them more power and more influence than they've ever had. And after that, since that time, their influence has been in decline. They got a pretty good punch in the nose, I would say, from the new atheists, right? Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris. Those folks gave them a pretty solid punch in the nose. And so did the internet. The internet gave them a pretty solid punch in the nose also, right? The fact that people can now get on the internet and Google the things that they're saying. And the number of people, especially among the younger generations, that adhere to the ideas of the Christian right is decreasing, right? Young people pull out their phones and they Google when the Christian right, they put up a picture that proves that the earth is only 6,000 years old because, look, you've got a dinosaur footprint next to a human footprint, so therefore there's no such thing as Darwin's evolution. The teenager then pulls out their phone and Googles it and debunks it. The information revolution, the new atheists, they've weakened the Christian right? And I don't think they've weakened Christianity. I think Christianity as a religion is quite strong, but the Christian right, the evangelical Christian right, is quite weakened. And the Bush years was kind of their last hurrah. And actually, the majority of Christian evangelicals voted for Barack Obama both times, interestingly. No one talks about that. And now, lo and behold, we see the Republican Party really get taken over. Trump swept in, and the reason that Trump was so victorious, and the reason Trump won the Republican nomination in 2016 is he was saying, look, I am not a normal Republican, right? And he went in there, and the neocons, the neoconservatives that have used and cultivated the Christian right, got blown away. And Trump came in there, and you'll remember he made the joke about the size of his hands in the debates, and he was crass, and he was rude, and he's been married multiple times, and he, Donald Trump is not the kind of person that any Bible thumper, any evangelical could respect, right? With his foul mouth and his attitude and his rudeness and his lifestyle that he lives. And the evangelicals are losing influence. Now, Trump then nominated, of course, a big evangelical, Mike Pence, to be his vice president. But lo and behold, the Christian right is losing power in the Republican Party, and it's losing it fast. Young people in conservative areas are not becoming evangelicals. The evangelical churches they don't have the influence they once had, and they're losing power. And the thing is, a lot of people inside the Republican Party are thinking more and more like Steve Bannon. They're thinking more and more, in terms of isolationism, economic nationalism. These ideas are growing. People talk about the rise of alt-right and things to that effect, and that ultimately the neocon faction is losing ground in the Republican Party, and the evangelical Christian movement, they are so important to that neocon faction. So my prediction is that in order to re-strengthen the evangelical movement within the Republican Party, they are going to grant a victory a victory to the Christian right. They're going to make it so that Georgia and Alabama and Texas and Mississippi and states like that can outlaw abortion. I think that's going to happen. And the reason that they're going to do it is because they want all these young, all these, not young people, all these folks in red states that are part of the evangelical Christian right. They want all of them to feel like their movement has momentum, like the people in Washington, D.C. are listening to them, like they're getting things done. And I don't think it'll lead to abortion being illegal in the United States overall. That definitely won't happen. And in fact, I think even some of these trigger laws they have in the states, like Alabama and Georgia and Texas, where they want to make it illegal to leave the state with the intent of getting an abortion, that'll be overturned. I think the Rockefeller family and the liberal wing of American capitalism will set up a scholarship fund to pay for your bus trip to New York or wherever you go to get an abortion. Right? There is a big section of the American ruling class that wants abortion to remain legal. I would say the majority of the ruling class of the United States would prefer that abortion remain legal, not because they care about women's rights, but because they feel like there's too many of us, especially with automation, right? They don't need workers anymore, and there are too many of us, and we're breeding, and we're having revolutions and protests, and we're supporting the rise of populist governments around the world. They talk about overpopulation. That's been an obsession of the Rockefellers. It's an obsession of Bill Gates, right? There's just too many of us working class people. Bill Gates feels that way. The Rockefellers feel that way. I'm sure Jeff Bezos feels that way. There's just too many common people, too many working class people in the world. We're breeding too much. And so they're going to do everything they can to keep abortion legal. But my prediction is it will be illegal in Georgia and Alabama, but they'll enable people in Georgia and Alabama to get on a bus and go to New York to get their abortion, to go to, some other state and get their abortion. Now, one wild card is the rise of these southern cities, right? The hipster centers, right? Places like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example. These cities, Atlanta, Georgia, right, that are really trying to become gentrified and hipsterized. It's not going to be a big selling point. Not many young hipsters are going to want to move to a state where they just outlawed abortion. So there you go. Now, my prediction is that they will, in order to try and control the Republican Party, to give more oomph to the Christian right, they'll allow abortion to be outlawed in certain states. But I could be wrong. It hasn't happened yet. And I feel like, at the end of the day, the two most powerful wings of American politics, they would love to have an abortion fight. And you can tell it. You turn on Fox this week, you turn on MSNBC this week, you turn on CNN this week, they want to have this fight so bad. Oh, they are so excited. This is what they want. This is what they know how to do. This is politics getting back to normal. Right? The Hillary Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, with liberal feminists and advocates of women's rights and the evangelical neocon wing of the Republican Party that says family values and Christianity and we need to get back to the Bible. They want this so bad because this is a fight where they get to be in charge. The Hillary Clinton DNC wing can be the advocates of keeping abortion, quote, legal and rare, and lo and behold, the conservative, neocon, evangelical, bomb Venezuela, have lots of wars, and support the U.S. military establishment. That wing, they want to have this fight so bad. Culture wars, the culture Kampf, right? That's a term. Now, a lot of people will tell you that culture Kampf or culture war is a Nazi term. The Nazis probably used it, but it goes back way further than that. As Germany was emerging as a country, the Kaiser, the German state, figured out that a way to control the population and weaken the power of the Marxist movement and social democracy was to stage Kulturkampfs. And it was mainly between Catholic Germans and non-Catholic Germans, and that the Catholic Church would have one position of something they wanted to be illegal, or some rule or some law that they wanted, or something about how the schools would be set up, and the Catholic Germans would all be for it, because they were Catholic, and they were in the Catholic areas, and they went to Catholic schools, and they went to the church on Sunday, and the Protestant Germans and the secular Germans would be against it. And it was a way of playing German workers against each other and moving the conversation away from class struggle. And that the Kaiser's regime in Germany, as they were facing the rise of what became the biggest Marxist party in the world until World War I, the German Social Democratic Party, that's, if you read Karl Marx's Critique of the Gotha Program, that's the party, that's the Gotha Program, that's the German SPD. As the German Social Democratic Party was becoming more and more powerful, and gaining more and more influence, and trade unions were spreading all across Germany. Marxism was rising in Germany. German workers were striking and demanding their rights on the job. The Kaiser's regime would stage culture comps. And culture comps are perfect because it's not an issue you can resolve, right? Right. There might be some people who believe that, hey, if we raise the minimum wage, that'll hurt the economy. And there might be some people who believe that actually it won't. And you can discuss, and you can debate, and you can convince people. I have convinced many people to become socialists. I've argued with many people and won many people to socialism. But I can guarantee you that I have never and I will never change anyone's mind about abortion. If someone in the United States is part of the evangelical Christian right, or they're Roman Catholic, and they believe that abortion is the equivalent of murder, there is nothing I can do to change that. There's nothing you can do to change that. You're arguing with someone's fundamental beliefs. In order for them to admit that abortion were not murder, in order for them to come to that conclusion, you would basically have to deconstruct everything about their identity, everything about their religion. You would have to completely change their worldview, right? And you're not going to do that, right? The way that they see their family, the way that they see the society they lived in, you'd have to completely reshuffle all of that to convince somebody who believes abortion is murder that abortion is not murder. Ain't going to happen. You're not going to change anyone's mind on that issue. So it's just a culture war, right? It's a culture war, right? It is a worldview. Do you think that abortion is the equivalent of murder? Do you think that abortion is a woman's right? Is something that's a woman's business? Maybe it is, but that's not completely clear, and it's an ethical decision that should be left up to the mother. Or do you believe that abortion should be treated as if it is a capital offense, right? It's a murder, right? The people who believe abortion is murder, you will never change their mind. I can guarantee you that. It's trying to convince someone who's a flat earther that the earth is round. I mean, it's just, they've taken a leap of faith. They believe this. Their family believes this. Their community believes this. You're not going to change them. And that's what's so perfect about it. It's not an argument that can be won or resolved. It's an argument that can only result in further division of people, just like the Kulturkampfs that the Kaiser staged in Germany, right? And he would trying to divide the German working class and prevent the rise of Marxism. He would play the Catholic workers against the Protestant workers in his Kulturkampfs. It's about controlling people, right? And I can guarantee you that Hillary Clinton would love to have a big evangelical fight with the evangelicals over abortion. The DNC wing of the Democratic Party is just as excited about this as the conservative evangelicals are. They both want to take back control of their parties. The Republican neocons want to beat down economic nationalism and right-wing populism. The DNC and the mainstream Democratic Party, the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the DuPonts, and you can go down the line. David Cohen, who is the top lobbyist for Comcast, who had the fundraiser at his house, to launch Joe Biden's campaign. Those folks really, really want to have an abortion fight. They are excited. Please, they're sitting there. Please give us a big abortion fight. Let's make abortion the big issue that U.S. politics is all about, because no one's mind is going to change, and the Christian conservatives will line up against the liberals, and it'll be a culture clash, and it'll be California and New York versus Texas and Idaho, and they want this so bad. They want politics in the United States to get back to normal. That's what they want. They really, really want. The mainstreams of the Republican and Democratic Party, they want politics in the USA to go back to how it was before the financial meltdown of 2008. They want the Bush years back. It was so easy during the Bush years, right? You were with Bush or you're against him. It was so easy. It was culture struggle. It was, they want it back. They want politics in the USA to get back to normal. They want a culture war. They want Christian evangelicals fighting against liberal hippies and nonconformists. They want, latte drinking, SUV driving, yuppie liberals fighting against average working men who go to church on Sunday and have guns. And they want it to be like that again. They really want politics in the USA to go back to the Cold War normal. right? The Okie from Muskogee. That was a hit song during the Nixon years. I'm proud to be an Okie from Muskogee, right? It was the hippies, the urban, liberal, yuppie, hippie, middle-class, intellectual types, and the African-American community and the Latino community versus the white working class of, conservative labor aristocracy. That's what they want. They want the fight to line up like that. U.S. politics is not going to go that way. I'll just tell you, folks, U.S. politics is not going to go back to the way it was during the Cold War, no matter how much these guys want it. They really want it. They really, really want U.S. politics to go back to the Cold War normal. Not going to happen, but having a big abortion fight is going to be their attempt to do it that way. There's an old expression that generals always fight the last war, right? If you look at World War I, for the first bit of World War I, our generals were trying to fight the Civil War. For the first part of the Civil War, our generals were trying to fight the Revolutionary War. They had muskets and everything, right? The generals are always fighting the last war. The war happens, and the generals remember, what did we do wrong? How could we have fought that war more effectively? And they go to the next war with new conditions, having learned everything from the last war, and they fight the new war as if it is the last war, doing everything even better than they did it before. That's basically what's going on. And that's what's happening with Elliott Abrams. That's what's happening with John Bolton with Venezuela. They're fighting the Cold War, and they think they're fighting the Cold War better. They've remembered all their mistakes. They've summed up everything they did wrong during the Cold War, and they're trying to fight the Cold War against the Soviet Union in Latin America, in Venezuela in 2019, and it's not working because they're fighting the last war. Generals fighting the last war. That's what's going on here. An abortion fight, an epic battle over whether or not a fetus should be granted the rights of a full human being, whether or not you should declare a fetus to be a person, and that fight about whether abortion should be legal or illegal, or whether states should be allowed to outlaw abortion, that fight is generals fighting the last war. It is the ruling class trying their hardest to get back to the Cold War, middle America normal. And it's not going to happen. It's not going to work, but it's their attempt. And that's my prediction, that to escalate the culture kampf, right? To get evangelical and conservative Americans up in arms against liberal, feminist, middle-class, urban Americans, to have that divide, to get the culture kampf going, my prediction is that they're going to allow certain states, red states, to outlaw abortion. That's my prediction. That's my prediction. I hope it doesn't happen. I don't think that would be good for the country to have that divide escalate, because I think at the end of the day, we don't need to be whipsawed. We don't need the working class of the United States to be zzz. We need class struggle politics. When Bernie Sanders talks about a 50-state strategy, I think he's on to something, right? We need there to be economic-based class struggle in the United States, and escalating a culture war is a guaranteed way to keep it happening. But my prediction is, in the hopes of trying to get the United States back to political normal, they are going to outlaw abortion in certain states, but they will not outlaw it at a federal level, and they'll basically make sure that all the people living in those states, all the women living in those states, still kind of have access with a scholarship fund so they can get on the bus and drive to whatever state where it's legal. I think that they will keep abortion accessible, but they'll allow certain states to outlaw it. That is Caleb Maupin's prediction. I have been wrong before, but I have been right before too. So keep in mind, right? And I'm not telling you it'll happen immediately. I think it'll gradually happen. But my prediction is, give it a couple years maybe, they'll overturn Roe versus Wade. Abortion will remain accessible in the United States, but they'll allow certain states to overturn it in order to re-energize the evangelicals and spark the culture war they desperately want to have. That's my prediction on that. So much more to talk about today. I see a lot of things in the comments section, a lot of things people want me to talk about. Now, I see Kazuya says small population left versus majority support Democrats, Republican parties plus war on Iran. I see Gabriel Castro saying, Caleb, what are your thoughts on Marx's pamphlet on the Jewish question? You know, Marx wrote that when he was a very young man, and it's a strange pamphlet, and you know, I think it needs to be understood in the context of the time it was written. I haven't really dug into it. I'd have to do a study of that pamphlet. Now, Shonen Ronan says, for the woman involved, I doubt they dehumanize the fetus. There you go. Now, folks, I want to make this a bigger conversation, so please, if you're just joining us now, please tweet this out. Please bring more folks in. But I want to talk about a couple other points here. Now, I was opening the Wall Street Journal, which I read the weekend Wall Street Journal. I read it during the week too, but I particularly love the weekend edition because it's more broad. There's more articles like summarizing overall trends. It's not like day-to-day news as it happens. So I noticed that on the op-ed page, on the opinion page, we've got this lovely, lovely piece here, Reclaiming History from Howard Zinn. And it's an interview with an author, author of a new book, and he's talking all about why he doesn't like Howard Zinn, right? And Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, I must say, is a great, great book. It's a really, really good book, and it's a lot of people's gateway drug to leftism. It's a very, very exciting book. I like Howard Zinn. The neocons do not, and obviously there's this individual, I'm not even going to name him because I don't want to give him the advertising, who's written a new book. He's going to try to counter Howard Zinn. He argues that Howard Zinn has too much power on the universities, that narrative is too strong. They're trying to rebrand U.S. history to be more in line with the prevailing narrative that the United States is a benevolent power that goes around rescuing oppressed people. I like Howard Zinn, and what I think is interesting is when Howard Zinn died, it became public that he had been a member of the Communist Party of the United States at one point. And what's interesting is the year that Howard Zinn joined the Communist Party of the United States was not a time when that was a trendy thing to do. In the late 30s, to join the Communist Party was not a big deal, right? It was in Hollywood, from like when the Popular Front was going on, what they called the Popular Front, the People's Front Against Fascism, from about 1935 up until about 1939, and even up into the Second World War, up until the end of the Second World, 1945, for about a decade, from 1935 to 1945, joining the Communist Party basically meant you supported the President of the United States because they were in a solid alliance with Roosevelt. And joining the Communist Party of the United States, it meant you were against fascism. You thought that fascism was bad. It meant that you supported labor unions. It meant that you went to a communist club meeting about once a week. It meant that you campaigned for Democrats. But it wasn't, you weren't viewed as a subversive. You weren't viewed as a traitor. The Communist Party was quite powerful during that time, and that joining it was not, it wasn't a huge deal. A lot of people, Charlie Chaplin was associated with the Communist Party. He was the most famous actor. Lillian Hellman, a very award-winning playwright, wrote the first play about gay rights, which was ever on Broadway. It's called The Children's Hour. She was a member of the Communist Party. A lot of people joined the Communist Party during the late 1930s, even in the early 40s, because at that point, it was part of the ruling coalition. It was part of the Roosevelt coalition that had power. And they were a faction within the Roosevelt government, and they had like one guy in Congress. He wasn't actually a member. He was part of the American Labor Party. His name was Vito Marcantonio, but everybody knew he was a Communist Party sympathizer. He was even part of the fraternal organization of the Communist Party, called the International Workers' Order, and that the Communist Party, joining it at that point, was it was kind of a trendy, hip thing to do. And that's why during McCarthyism, all these people got up and apologized, because half of Hollywood had been in the Communist Party during that point, because it was a trendy thing to do, and you were supporting Roosevelt, and you were against the Nazis, and you were a faction. However, in the 50s, right, after about 1946, when the Cold War got going, when the leadership of the Communist Party was put in federal prison in 1948, when almost every state in the USA passed a criminal communism or criminal syndicalism law that made it illegal to be a member of the Communist Party. To stay in the Communist Party in the 50s was a big deal. And furthermore, to join the Communist Party in the 1950s was a really big deal, right? Because 24/7, the TV, the newly invented television, the televisions that were all over American homes were telling people, the Communist Party is your enemy. And the Communist Party, it was like associating with them was not a trendy thing to do. And it was apparently in 1951, during the middle of all of this, that Howard Zinn, the young Howard Zinn, apparently joined the Communist Party of the United States. And I have a theory, folks, because we all know Howard Zinn's contribution was the People's History of the United States. I have a theory. I think that Howard Zinn was inspired to write the People's History of the United States by this book, The Outline Political History of the Americas, right? This was a book published by the Communist Party of the United States around the time that Howard Zinn was a member. It was published in 1951, the year, I believe, that Howard Zinn joined the Communist Party. And it was William Z. Foster, the great American Marxist. It was his attempt to retell the history of the United States of America in a Marxist way. And I encourage you, if you can get your hands on a copy of The Outline Political History of the Americas by William Z. Foster, give it a read. It's a great book. It really is. And it's not just a history of the United States. It's a history of South America, Central America as well. He talks about Cuba. And he goes up from the time of the first Spanish settlers coming all the way up until the end of the Second World War. Very powerful, giving special attention to socialism and Marxism. But he goes over all the countries. He talks about Peronism. He talks about all kinds of stuff. And it's a very good book. But I will say, part of what separates William Z. Foster and this book that was written by the man who built the Communist Party, the man who led the Communist Party when it was powerful, when it was a very effective and powerful organization that had influence over millions of people, even though it only had maybe tens of thousands of members. When this book was published, the man who wrote it, William Z. Foster, the author of this book, right? The way he explains U.S. history and the way Howard Zinn explains U.S. history on the surface might seem the same. They might seem basically the same, right? He's talking about class struggle, he's talking about the rulers versus the people, but there are some key differences. And those differences point to why Howard Zinn's book is available all over college campuses, and this is pretty obscure. For example, Howard Zinn, when it comes to the Civil War, he and his People's History of the United States basically tries to be plague on both your houses, right? That Lincoln committed atrocities, and so did the slave. He tries to, be neutral kind of in the Civil War. However, William Z. Foster has the Marxist position that Abraham Lincoln and the Second American Revolution was progressive and that the slave system needed to be smashed and that was a progressive moment. If you read it, William Z. Foster is pointing toward the birth of the Communist Party as a powerful organization that points the way to lead the USA out of all the awful things he describes, like slavery and racism and the slaughter of the indigenous people and the suffering and the attacks on labor unions. He's pointing toward the Communist Party. He's pointing toward an ideology. Howard Zinn, he builds up this notion of people's movements, right? And he talks about the unemployment councils and the trade unions and all of that, but it's always just the movement that's good. And he spends the book deconstructing. It's all about deconstruction. He deconstructs the myth of the Founding Fathers, right? The idea that they were all just a bunch of, nice guys who loved democracy while they were slaveholders, while they had some authoritarian tendencies. He rips apart the myth of Christopher Columbus. He deconstructs myths very effectively. And he talks about how popular socialism became. He emphasizes protest movements, but he doesn't push ideology. It's all about deconstruction. He deconstructs the mythology surrounding American history. And that's why all these baby boomer professors think it's amazingly profound, right? That what they got spoon-fed in school is disproved by Howard Zinn. But he doesn't replace it with anything. He deconstructs the ideology of the United States of America, but he doesn't replace it with anything. William Z. Foster replaces the American ideology with Marxism-Leninism, right? And with the Communist Party line from the 1950s. Howard Zinn does not do that. And so Howard Zinn leaves you feeling, it leads to a place where if you just read Howard Zinn, you can get excited about the movement and the people, I guess, but that, 1960s, there's not a movement now, really. And it leads you to this place of there is no truth, there is no hope, and in a way, it's not really dangerous to the establishment, right? And that's why Howard Zinn is everywhere and Foster isn't. I do think, though, that Zinn, who was a young man in the Communist Party, he was in his 20s when he was in the Communist Party, and he got his hands on, this book. I think something like this, a text like this probably had a lot to do with inspiring him to write his People's History of the United States. And I think that part of the reason that the left is weak is that it's simply focused on this deconstruction. You can take apart the myths of the United States, that the USA is an infallible country, that it never does anything wrong, goes around the world rescuing people from dictators, right? You can tell people that, but if you just stop there, all that leads to is demoralization, right? It leads to this, okay, everyone I've been told to worship is a liar. Okay, so the world's full of liars, right? If you don't build up an alternative, if you don't see any rising force of progress, again, like, for example, if you look at the U.S. Civil War, right? If you see Lincoln as being just as bad as the slaveholders, what side are you going to fight on? Well, you're not going to fight on a side, right? You're just going to sit back and go, oh, the world is an awful place, killing, slavery, Lincoln, Southern slave. It leads to a place of demoralization. It leads to a place of not really taking any action, of just kind of sitting back and being demoralized and hopeless. And that's what a lot of left material does. It deconstructs, but it doesn't construct. It tears things down, but it doesn't build anything up. And that is the problem with a lot of leftist material. And that's why we need to go back and read things like William Z. Foster, right? Read Howard Zinn. I'm not against reading Howard Zinn. A lot of what he says, my disagreements with it are largely minor. What I disagree with is what's missing, right? Is that he builds up the movement. Movements are great. Movements. And that was always one of my biggest pet peeves. That was the dumbest thing. When I was an active leftist, I was in an organization, and they were always talking about the movement, the movement, the movement, the movement, the movement. They're out of touch with reality. The number of people that are in the protest cage is very, very small, right? The number of people who attend anti-war rallies and all of that. The broad masses of millions of Americans is who you should be aiming for if you actually want to change the country. But this idea of the movement, that comes out of the 60s, the movement. And it's interesting because, in fact, movementism is considered to be a deviation of Marxism. Lo and behold, right? Edward Bernstein, the first revisionist, who actually called himself a revisionist. His slogan was, "The movement is everything, the goal is nothing." That was his slogan. He said, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. I can guarantee you, a lot of people that I knew when I was an activist would agree with that 100%. They always looked at me, Caleb, you're always talking about history and books and ideology and Marx. Oh, but we just love the movement, man. We want to protest and and only racist white men read books. You're racist and you're a nerd and we just love to protest and have fun. Woo, protest and rally. That's Edward Bernstein. The movement is everything. The goal is nothing, right? It's all just about, it's just about being involved in protests and demonstrations. It's not about actually changing the way people think. It's not changing the way people see the world. It's, that's, anti-intellectualism. That's what Verothius is calling it. That's a good way of putting it, but it's not simply anti-intellectualism. It's a departure from ideology. It's politics without ideology, right? If it's all about the movement, there's no ideology there. Lenin polemicized against Edward Bernstein, and in his book, What is to be Done, he said, without a revolutionary theory, there is no revolutionary movement, right? That the movement, in and of itself, is nothing, right? The movement is not everything. The movement is nothing. The only reason the movement matters is because it achieves the goal, right? The goal is everything. The movement is nothing, right? That if the goal is not being achieved, the movement is worthless. And ultimately now, as the 60s left has, died and gotten old, what's left of the movement is basically a wing of the political establishment, right? The Stop Trump mobs that are promoted on CNN are not going to lead to socialism. They're not going to lead to socialism. They're led by a wing of the ruling class that wants to control Donald Trump because they fear he's a populist. That's really all that's there. And so to be a movementist in the 60s made sense. To be a movementist in the 80s made sense. To be a movementist in the 90s, even during the Bush years, to be a movementist made sense. To be a movementist now makes absolutely no sense. The movement, what people call the movement, right? Those group of people who go to liberal rallies, that fringe of the Democratic Party, liberal activists, people who go to protests who are Democratic Party liberals, they are more pro-war than average Americans are. Let me repeat that. Polls have come out and showed that average Americans are more against wars than active rank-and-file Democratic Party and liberal activists are. I go to these rallies, right? I have a job. I go to these rallies and interview people. I don't participate. I'm not an activist, but I go and do media coverage of these rallies. Go to a Stop Trump rally and ask people there what they think about North Korea. You'll have pictures, protest signs with Trump's face next to Kim Jong-il, Trump's face next to Putin. Their grievance against Trump is that he's not warlike enough. They will have Trump with a big hammer and sickle behind him, right? Trump is a communist, right? I mean, it's, the people that are more critical of the system tend to be, the more on the right, and that's as weird as it is. Their ideology and their worldview is completely wrong, but they tend to be more critical of the system than folks on the left. The rank and file Democrat, the movement is more in line with the ideology of the ruling class than conservatives are, and then the broad masses of people are. Your average person who's not politically active thinks the wars are lies. They don't trust the government. Your average rank and file Democrat thinks Putin is threatening our democracy and Maduro is a dictator, and that's what I'm telling you folks, that's how the movement thinks. The movement at one point the movement was a section of U.S. society that was more progressive than the rest. Now, the movement is a section of U.S. society that is being mobilized to defend the establishment as average people start to wake up. So being a movementist at this point is 180 degrees away from where you need to be, right? I mean, the Inundation says the left movement these days are McCarthyists. Yes, exactly, right? The movement at this point is about keeping U.S. society in line. And to be a movementist in this day and age is just wrong. And if you read Howard Zinn's writings, it leads you to the conclusion that the movement is everything. It's all about the movement. It's not all about the movement. The movement is nothing. The goal is everything. I mean, but I digress, right? There's plenty more we can talk about. I'm going to pour more of my favorite beverage. Now, I'm sure people saw me tweeting about it earlier, but I just... every so often, you have to appreciate it. On some level, you get mad when you see stuff like this in the mainstream press because so many people believe it and just repeat it blindly. Welcome, J24. But at the same time, when you see articles like this, part of me, what do they say? You salivate. It's like you get hungry. You get because you can just eat this up. You can really, really just eat this up. Right? I can rip this to shreds. But what makes me mad is that so many people buy it. This article here, The Global Crisis of Democracy. Right? This is the front page of the weekend review of the Wall Street Journal. They got, the Statue of Liberty looking all sad. The global crisis of democracy as China and Russia attack free governments and push strongman rule. The U.S. has gone silent, and a new wave of authoritarianism is gathering. They're condemning Trump. Apparently, Trump has gone silent, right? I mean, he's not trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. He's not trying to overthrow the government of Iran. He's just not, with his new sanctions on Russia. Apparently, he's silent. I mean, this is stupid and ridiculous. But this article, written by some really, I'm not even going to say the name, don't want to give him the advertising, but... written by somebody who's supposed to be so respected and prominent. I'm going to read you some gems from the article. President Trump has insulted U.S. allies, befriended Vladimir Putin, excused a grim list of other dictators, and embraced nativist politics, and has shaken the World War II liberal order. Right? Trump has put more sanctions on Russia. Trump has sent lethal weapons to Ukraine. Trump is, I don't see Trump befriending Vladimir Putin or other anti-imperialist regimes around the world. But if you go on, the article really, it's revisionist history, if anything. So it starts talking about all these waves of democracy that took place around the world, right? Of countries that were authoritarian, right? For example, it talks about how, when Reagan was president, Augusto Pinochet, that by the time he left office, U.S.-aligned governments that were dictatorships became democracies. He says, Augusto Pinochet's Chile, Ferdinand Marcos' Philippines, a coup-prone South Korea, and apartheid South Africa. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, all four of these regimes were gone or fading, followed in short by order of the Soviet Union itself. And if you go through the article, it tries to give the impression that Ronald Reagan is somehow responsible for breaking up apartheid in South Africa, for bringing democracy to South Korea, for toppling Pinochet, and for what's the other one here? For bringing down Marcos in the Philippines. Well, anyone who knows anything about the Reagan administration knows that nothing can be further from the truth. Right? The Reagan administration escalated U.S. support for Pinochet, escalated support for U.S. For the apartheid government of South Africa, for the dictatorship in the Philippines, for South Korea, and that in all of those countries, in Chile, in Philippines, in South Africa, and in South Korea, who were leading all the protests and demonstrations demanding democracy? Communists, leftists, socialists, right? I mean, in the ANC was aligned very closely with the Communist Party of South Africa, almost to the point that at one point, Nelson Mandela was actually a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party. So how in the world is Ronald Reagan, who backed the apartheid government, but was, according to this article, you get the impression he was gradually, influencing it from behind the scenes or something, Reagan declared the African National Congress to be terrorists. They were on the foreign terrorist list, right? And so somehow Reagan is responsible for the toppling of a regime he backed and supported. And that's pretty ridiculous. Now, you go, South Korea, Pinochet's Chile. What happened is, as the Cold War was coming to an end in the late 80s, as the Soviet Union was being weakened, it became possible for the Bonapartist regimes, right, the Park Chung-hee dictatorship in South Korea and the military government in South Korea, the Pinochet government in Chile, these governments that were Bonapartist dictatorships backed by the United States to fight communism loosened up, basically, right? They did not need that level of authoritarianism, and that the ruling classes of those countries wanted a more rule by consensus, right? If you were part of the faction in Chile who got along with Pinochet, you liked him. But there were a lot of people in the Chilean ruling class who didn't care for Pinochet because they were not from the right family, they didn't get the government business deals, right? And that having a more liberal democratic system is something that most factions of the ruling class would prefer. They turn to Bonapartist authoritarianism and what you could call dictatorship, capitalist dictatorship, when there is a crisis. When South Korea, when you had North Korea that had already started, aligning with the Soviet Union, become a socialist country. In South Korea, to keep order, the USA propped up a series of Bonapartist authoritarian dictatorships in South Korea. Park Chung-hee, right? Syngman Rhee. And those dictators, Park Chung-hee in particular, what they were able to do is they took a lot of dramatic economic activity to control the economy and try to stabilize things to prevent there from being a revolution. And the same with Chile, right? That after the Chicago Boys left, after the debacle of the 1970s and the early 80s, you even saw the Pinochet regime nationalize things and try to take dramatic reforms in order to stave off a crisis. And ultimately, as the Cold War was coming to an end, these authoritarian regimes that were backed by the United States loosened up because there was no threat of communist revolution. The danger of socialist revolution coming into these countries that were aligned with the USA was pretty much fading away and gone. And so as a result, there was a loosening up, a softening up around the world, and that happened. Now, to say that that's all because of Reagan is absurd. And in fact, what was key in a lot of these countries is from the moment Pinochet took power to the moment he was driven out of power, there was a progressive underground communist resistance movement, right? That the Communist Party of Chile and the MIR, the Movement of the Revolutionary Left in Chile, and the Socialist Party, they were illegal, but they were underground, organizing strikes and protests and underground trade unions, and and the same for Spain under Franco, and the same for all of these authoritarian regimes that were backed by the United States. There was a communist-led resistance fighting for democracy. Even in Taiwan, right? And this article talks about Taiwan and how Taiwan ended military rule in the 80s. Well, from the moment that Chiang Kai-shek's white terror started in Taiwan, there was a resistance. And even today in Taiwan, you have the Labor Party of Taiwan that are basically, they're sympathetic with Marxism, and so this notion that these regimes, it was the United States in the goodness of its heart spreading democracy that caused all the Cold War dictatorships to loosen up. No, the United States enabled and strengthened these authoritarian regimes, especially South Africa. Goodness gracious. Nelson Mandela sent Ronald Reagan sent guns and weapons and gave all kinds of support to the apartheid government of South Africa. Meanwhile, the ANC was declared to be a terrorist group. In what country is Ronald Reagan responsible? In what universe is he responsible for bringing down apartheid? It was communists and progressives around the world who were aligned with the African National Congress that were key in bringing down apartheid. But the article goes on from there. I'm just going to have some more fun with this, right? Now, it goes on. This is my favorite. Nicaragua's far-left Sandinista dictator, Daniel Ortega, was defeated at the polls. Yes, in the 1990s, the Sandinistas, the Socialist Party that had led the revolution to topple Somoza, the brutal dictator backed by the United States in 1979, after a decade of civil war in which they'd been fighting for their lives against Contras and terrorists who burned healthcare clinics and destroyed schools, after a decade of war in which hundreds of thousands of people died in Nicaragua, in the early 90s, in 1992, I believe, they had an election. And Daniel Ortega lost the election and he stepped down. How in the world are you a dictator if you step down after losing the election, right? But he's a dictator. Why? Because he's a dictator, because he doesn't like the United States. And that comes across the more and more you read the article. Because he's talking about how the USA is spreading democracy all over the world, even in countries where it was clearly not promoting democracy and backing authoritarian leaders. And then he's talking about how great, the dictator steps down, even though the dictator, and there you go. And then it gets to the end of the article, and the end of the article, and the point of the article, the reason they published the article, is to attack Vladimir Putin in Russia and to attack the Bolivarian governments. And it's talking about the new rise of authoritarianism around the world, and it gives us this lovely paragraph here, and I'm going to read it to you. In one country after another, elected leaders, do you hear that? Elected leaders. In one country after another, elected leaders gradually attacked deep tissues of democracy. Now, what are these deep tissues? The independence of the courts, the business community, the media, civil society, universities, and sensitive state institutions like the civil service, the intelligence agencies, and the police. Whether the agent of destruction is a right-wing nationalist like Vladimir Putin in Russia or a left-wing Bolivarian socialist like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, the effect is the same. The structures and norms of democracy are eviscerated one by one until all that is left is a hollow shell. Here's the thing. Translation for you. Here's what he's saying, basically. In all these countries, all these institutions that he named, right? The courts, civil society, the universities, sensitive state institutions, intelligence agencies, the police, all of them de facto are supposed to serve Wall Street and London, right? The courts are supposed to rule in favor of Wall Street and London. The business community is supposed to be, submissive so Wall Street and London corporations can come in there and dominate the economy. The police are supposed to, arrest people who go on strike and enforce the will of international corporations. Every institution across the developing world, every institution across the entire world is supposed to serve the United States. And these countries, like Russia, like Venezuela, like Bolivia, like Nicaragua, they elect leaders who go in there and change that. Change that. So, lo and behold, people around the world want their courts and their business community and their civil society institutions and their universities not to serve Wall Street and London anymore. They want them to serve the domestic population. So a leader that they elect comes in there and changes that. That is dictatorship. This is crazy to me, right? They're basically saying that the natural order, the way things are supposed to be, is the USA and Wall Street and London having a global monopoly and running the world, right? And when all these institutions, like universities, like police, like courts, like when they stop serving the West, when they stop serving Wall Street and London, they're no longer independent. When they're doing what they're supposed to do, they rule in. Anybody let's talk about it, right? What happened in Russia in the 1990s? Was Russia's court system and civil society and all of that independent in the 1990s and now it's not? No. Boris Yeltsin's government was working for Wall Street. It was working for Bill Clinton. And they went in there and they gutted the country like crazy. The population was overwhelmingly against the economic reforms that were forced on Russia in the 1990s. However, the courts and the universities and the civil society all enforced the will of Wall Street. Right? That's back when they were independent. And then, as things changed, as the country moved away from that, as Putin got in there and started restructuring the economy, now those institutions serve Russia. So, they're no longer independent. They're independent when they do what Wall Street wants. Venezuela, same story. In the 1990s in Venezuela, was the Venezuelan court system independent when it blocked people from going on strike? When it put communists in jail? Were the police independent? Were the universities independent when they pushed free market ideology and said that the United States was great and that the communism was evil? Were these universities all independent? They're independent if they do what Wall Street and London say. and they're then all of a sudden becoming dictatorial and authoritarian when they start doing what is in the interests of Venezuelans, right? I mean, this is really shocking here. All over the world. What he's saying here is all over the world, the courts, the universities, the policing agencies, they're all supposed to serve Wall Street and London. And when they stop doing that, the country's becoming a dictatorship, even if they do it because of elected leaders. No one disputes that Vladimir Putin won the elections. No one in their right mind can dispute that Hugo Chavez and Bolivarianism won the elections. But when elected leaders get in there and change the nature of the political system so that it doesn't de facto allow the rule of Wall Street in London, that's dictatorship, right? Democracy is dictatorship. That's what he's saying. He's saying that the will of the people being enacted in Russia and in Latin America is dictatorship. If the people want the courts and the universities and the policing agencies and civil society and business to change, and they elect a leader who will change it, that's dictatorship. It's democracy as long as the West wins, and it's dictatorship as when people they don't like win. He's saying that, right? Elected leaders. I mean, it can't get more blatant. They're basically admitting here that if you change the nature of the way these institutions work, all of a sudden they're no longer independent. They can't make it more blatant. I'm fired up about this because it's like so many people I know will read this stuff and just digest this garbage. Wow. So if anything good happens, it's dictatorship, right? If the nature of the courts change, if the nature of any of these civil institutions changes, then it becomes a dictatorship. This is blatant. It's blatant. It's a democracy if they like it. It's a dictatorship if they don't. Can they be more blatant about this? Sorry I'm getting fired up here, folks. I'm having a great time. I know there's plenty of people that got things they want to talk about. I've got more, but I'm going to chill for a moment and drink more of my diet soda full of caffeine. It's a lovely day. Now, if Tulsi Gabbard becomes president, media will call her a dictator. Well, I'm sure that would be the case, right? If somebody got in who did what was against the interests of Wall Street and London, all of a sudden they're a dictatorship because the way things are supposed to work is the independent tissue of democracy is supposed to serve Wall Street and London. And when it stops doing that, it's becoming a dictatorship, right? That's what he's saying. I mean, the highlighted quote. Elected leaders are attacking the deep tissue of democracy. That's what he's... Elected leaders are attacking the deep tissue of democracy. It stops being a democracy when it starts eroding the power of Wall Street and London. That's what they're saying. They're blatantly saying that. They're spelling it out in plain English. It becomes a dictatorship when civil society starts to change. I'm frozen, folks. Oh boy. What's happening here? I'm frozen. Now, is it going to end the live or is it going to let me continue here? Am I going to have to start a new one? Oh boy. What's happening here? I'm frozen, but are they going to restart or what's going to happen? I'm glad you can hear me while I'm frozen. That's interesting. Now, this happened once before. I don't know what happens here. Now, if I freeze, I'll start another live, and I'll need someone to post it here. But if I don't, I'll just keep going. My goodness, those folks at YouTube must really love me, don't they? Oh, conspiracy theories aside, right? We don't want to get into that. But yeah, I'm just going to keep talking. I'm continuing to talk. I'm still here. I'm not moving. I'm frozen. So there you go. I'm reading the comments that people are leaving. I'm seeing people's comments. I'm just not seeing my own face moving. Yeah, flattering pose. Exactly. They've got me with my mouth half open. There you go. Now, it's weird. Now, if it was going to end the live, you would think that if it was going to now end the live, it would have stopped by now. So I don't know what's happening here. Now, someone says, disable and enable the camera again. I don't know if I can do that. I might try to figure that out. This is very, very weird. Yes, frozen here, but you're fine. Well, there you go. I know. I'll try to turn it around. And did that work? Turn it around? Oh, that's weird. Now it's just reversing the image. Okay. That's weird. I thought that would reverse the camera. This is very interesting. Mute microphone. What do I do here? How do I not end the live? That's the thing. I don't want to end the live. Oh boy. Okay. All right, folks, I think I'm going to have to restart. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to end the live, and I want somebody to immediately, as I start a new live on the channel, immediately post it in the chat so we can get going again. Immediately post the new link in the chat. Don't know why they're doing this to me, but hey, it is what it is. Life happens. So I'm going to end this live and start a new one.